On the 30th of April of 1945, Adolf Hitler took his life in the Chancellery bunker. Berlin burned under Soviet fire. The Third Reich crumbled within a matter of days. But while some high-ranking Nazis were captured in the weeks following the collapse, others simply disappeared. They did not die in combat. They did not surrender to the Allied forces. They left no identifiable bodies, nor clear traces. Between the end of April and May of 1945, several of the most wanted men in Europe vanished from the map amidst the terminal chaos of the Reich. Their names appeared on search lists marked as whereabouts unknown. Allied reports recorded them as not found. How did figures with so much responsibility in the Nazi apparatus disappear? What preparations had they made before the end? Why were some captured immediately while others vanished without a trace? Shadows of the collapse, missing men of the Reich. The early morning of the 30th of April of 1945 marked the point at which the National Socialist regime lost any possibility of continuity. In the Chancellery bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, while Soviet artillery advanced over the last defensive sectors of Berlin. The capital was exposed to a siege that had rapidly closed in since the 16th of April, when the Red Army launched the final offensive with more than 2 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and a concentrated volume of fire that far exceeded the German response capacity. The defences were composed of remnants of disorganised units, improvised groups, and divisions weakened by months of fighting. In that scenario, the Reich's political apparatus lost cohesion in a matter of hours. Some of its leaders were captured shortly after, while others disappeared without leaving immediate evidence of their fate. The combination of urban destruction, massive troop movements, chaotic evacuations, and lack of communications created the conditions for high-ranking figures to temporarily vanish from the historical record. In the days leading up to Hitler's suicide, the bunker operated as a command post, isolated from the rest of the country. Orders transmitted externally lacked enforceability, and the civilian and military personnel remaining underground understood that the collapse was irreversible. Martin Bormann, party secretary and main intermediary between Hitler and the rest of the Nazi leadership, maintained his influence due to his control over information and his constant presence alongside the dictator. This position allowed him to record the final political measures, including the appointment of Admiral Karl Dönitz as head of state and Joseph Goebbels as Reich Chancellor. The will signed on the night of the 29th of April established a succession structure that would have no practical effect, as the administration disappeared almost immediately after Hitler's death. Goebbels committed suicide on the 1st of May, after killing his children and informing the Soviets that he had no intention of negotiating surrender. With his death, the bunker ceased to function even as a symbolic center. Those who remained inside faced the decision to surrender or attempt to leave Berlin. Martin Bormann chose to flee, forming part of a group that included Ludwig Stumpfegger, Arthur Axmann, Werner Naumann, and other members of Hitler's close circle. The departure began on the night of the 1st to the 2nd of May. They advanced through subway tunnels to Friedrichstrasse and continued towards the Weidendammer Bridge, where Soviet units were already occupying positions. The presence of German armoured vehicles allowed for partial advancement, but an explosion scattered the group. Some managed to cross the Spree, others were disoriented amid the fighting. Axmann later stated that during his retreat, he saw 2 bodies in the Invalidenstrasse area. He claimed to have recognized Bormann and Stumpfegger without observing visible wounds. The testimony was recorded, but the absence of bodies prevented confirmation of its accuracy. The Soviet forces never reported finding any remains. For decades, Bormann's disappearance fueled conflicting hypotheses. He was tried in absentia in Nuremberg in 1946 and sentenced to death, but the sentence could not be executed. Reports of supposed sightings circulated among Western intelligence agencies, and various theories placed him in Central Europe, Italy, Spain, or South America. None of this could be corroborated. The resolution came in 1972, when workers digging near Lehrter station found skeletons hastily buried. The documents found on one of them corresponded to Stumpfegger. The other showed physical characteristics compatible with Bormann. Comparison with dental records provided by dentist Hugo Blaschke confirmed the identification. The presence of glass fragments in both jaws indicated suicide by cyanide capsules. The Berlin court officially declared Martin Bormann dead in 1973. Years later, mitochondrial DNA testing corroborated his identity. The case was closed, although his prolonged disappearance illustrated how the destruction of Berlin allowed even central figures of the regime to remain off the record for decades. The case of Hans Kammler presented a different scenario. Civil engineer and SS general, Kammler accumulated significant responsibilities in the final years of the war. He supervised the construction of facilities for extermination camps, managed advanced armament projects, and was appointed the overall head of the V-2 missile program from 1944. His position made him a priority target for the Allies, both for his crimes and for his knowledge of strategic projects. In the last days of the conflict, he moved through areas of southern Germany and Austria, accompanied by a small group. There are conflicting reports about his fate. Some close sources claimed he committed suicide with cyanide on the 9th of May near Prague, although no physical evidence was presented. Other versions mentioned an internal murder to prevent him from being captured. There were also reports placing him dead during an attack by Czechoslovak partisans. The driver Kurt Preuck declared in 1948 that Kammler had opted for suicide. That testimony allowed the widow to obtain official documentation of death in 1949. Decades later, the declassification of United States documents introduced doubts. Reports from the Counterintelligence Corps mentioned the capture of Kammler and his subsequent escape. An American investigator claimed to have supervised his retention until 1947. The absence of clear references in the Nuremberg trials or on the lists of wanted criminals is striking, considering his central role in several projects of the regime. That lack of follow-up fuels the possibility that Kammler was interrogated by the Allies to obtain technical and administrative information before allowing his disappearance from the record. There is no conclusive evidence to establish this hypothesis, but the combination of indications, documentary omissions, and contradictory testimonies keeps the case open to this day. Kammler represents the most extreme example of how a relevant figure could vanish without leaving a verifiable trace, despite the international attention on German weapons projects. A useful contrast is provided by Odilo Globoknik, responsible for Operation Reinhardt. He supervised the extermination centers of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, where around 1,700,000 people were killed. After his transfer to Trieste in 1943, he continued operating repressive structures from the Risiera di San Saba. At the end of the war, he fled to Austria with a group of collaborators. On the 31st of May 1945, a British patrol found the hideout where they were hiding. Identification was achieved due to an involuntary reaction to the call of his name. Globoknik was arrested along with Hermann Höfler, Ernst Lurch, and other members of his group. He kept a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth and used it hours later. His death was recorded and his body was identified beyond doubt, which allowed several of his collaborators to be prosecuted. Similar situations occurred with other leaders. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Main Security Office, tried to hide in the Austrian Alps, but was captured on the 13th of May by a United States counterintelligence operation. He was taken to trial in Nuremberg, convicted, and executed in 1946. These cases illustrate that, in the absence of prior planning, escape attempts quickly ended in capture or suicide. Mountainous or rural areas did not offer a viable escape route, given the level of control and search deployed by the Allied forces at the end of the war. The differences between those who disappeared temporarily and those who were detained are explained by specific factors. The existence of support networks, the preparation of false documents, the availability of shelters, and the anticipation of the end of the conflict determined the viability of any attempt at concealment. In the months leading up to the collapse, some commanders understood that defeat was inevitable and organized escape routes. Others relied on improvisation or the ability to blend in with the displaced population. The disorder of April and May of 1945 opened a brief but significant window of opportunity. While the Allies secured territories, managed massive surrenders, and reorganized civil administrations, certain individuals took advantage of that margin to disappear temporarily. The scale of chaos allowed even high-ranking figures to remain unlocated for weeks or years. The collapse of the Reich left millions of displaced people, hundreds of destroyed cities, and a collapsed administrative structure. In that environment, the disappearance of Nazi figures reflected both the magnitude of the disaster and the ability of certain individuals to exploit the confusion. Some cases were clarified over time thanks to exhumations, forensic analyses, and documentary studies. Others remain shrouded in contradictory versions or persistent gaps in the records. As the Allies consolidated control of Central Europe and judicial investigations began, the possibility of new disappearances decreased. However, the first few weeks after the collapse had left enough gaps to allow some relevant actors to vanish without immediate records. That phenomenon would mark the beginning of a stage in which efforts to locate fugitives, reconstruct escape routes, and clarify subsequent destinations would become a constant element of the post-war period. Discrete shelters, networks that protected the persecuted. In the months following the collapse of the Third Reich, support networks emerged that allowed several Nazi war criminals to escape immediate prosecution. Among them stood out the structure coordinated from the Teutonic College of Rome, where Bishop Alois Hudal used his ecclesiastical position and access to administrative resources to facilitate the escape of dozens of fugitives. The German seminary he directed, located a few meters from St. Peter's Basilica, was a strategic point for these operations. Hudal, an Austrian priest and rector since 1933, had publicly expressed his sympathy for National Socialism during the war, and continued to maintain the idea that those fleeing Allied justice were victims of a political reprisal rather than responsible for documented crimes. This conviction, combined with his access to ecclesiastical seals, official paper, and contacts within humanitarian organizations, allowed him to create false identity documents that presented members of the SS as Catholic refugees from territories threatened by communism. The procedure consisted of a chain of administratively simple but strategically calculated steps. The fugitives arrived in Rome through contacts in Austria or northern Italy, using discrete routes that avoided Allied inspections. Once at the Collegio Teutonico, they presented themselves to Hudal with false names and stories designed to justify their status as displaced persons. Hudal drafted letters on seminary paper certifying that the bearer was a German Catholic needing assistance to emigrate. With these letters, the fugitives could apply for travel documents from the International Red Cross or the International Refugee Organization, institutions that in 1945 and 46 faced an enormous administrative burden due to the millions of displaced persons in Europe. The limited verification capacity in those years facilitated the issuance of documentation based on invented identities that appeared coherent within the widespread chaos of the post-war period. The ecclesiastical network that supported Hudal included priests in Austria, who offered initial refuge in convents, monasteries, and parish residences. These shelters functioned as temporary stations where the fugitives waited for instructions on when to cross the Italian border. Communications were verbal or simply coded, avoiding written records that could compromise those involved. Once in Italy, the fugitives followed predetermined routes that connected parishes, convents, and seminaries, each managed by informed clerics who verified the legitimacy of the fugitive through cross-references. This web of protection did not rely on large clandestine operations, but rather on a succession of discrete supports that, when added together, created a safe route to Rome. The existence of this network did not go completely unnoticed within the Vatican. Some officials were aware of Hudal's activity, although there was no official intervention to stop him. The diplomatic position of the Catholic Church in 1945 was particularly delicate. while it publicly condemned Nazi crimes, it remained deeply concerned about the expansion of communism in Eastern Europe. This concern generated an ambiguous environment in which figures like Hudal could operate without direct sanction. The Allied authorities, for their part, faced limitations in Italy. Their efforts were concentrated on capturing high-ranking Nazis whose presence was documented, while thousands of displaced people traveled with seemingly valid documents issued by recognized humanitarian organizations. In that massive flow, the fugitives using Hudal's network were concealed among countless legal movements. Among those benefited by these routes was Franz Stangl, former commander of the Treblinka extermination camp, responsible for the administration of the site, where around 800,000 people died between 1942 and 1943. After his transfer to Trieste under the command of Odilo Globoknik, Stangl escaped to Austria at the end of the war and hid in rural properties of Upper Austria within the American occupation zone. There he received protection from former Nazi Party sympathizers, who provided him with accommodation, civilian clothing, and a controlled environment in which to remain out of public sight. For several months he remained in isolated hideouts while he analyzed the captures and convictions of other Nazi officers. He understood that his stay in Austria would be unsustainable without legal documentation and an organized exit plan. The connections with Hudal's network arose through former comrades of the NSDAP who maintained contacts with like-minded ecclesiastical circles. By the end of 1946, Stangl received detailed instructions to travel to Italy. The route included secure contact points in parishes in Austria and Italy, each one led by priests knowledgeable about the network. The journey was made using local transport and stretches of walking, avoiding direct controls by Allied forces. Once in Rome, Stangl was received by Hudal, who issued the necessary documentation to apply for a passport from the International Red Cross. He remained hidden in ecclesiastical facilities until the procedures were completed. Throughout this period, he stayed under the Allied radar, due to the effectiveness of the ecclesiastical reference system and the administrative saturation of humanitarian institutions. A different case was that of Gustav Wagner, former deputy commander of the Sobibor camp. Wagner did not initially resort to ecclesiastical networks. Instead, he integrated into a circle of former members of the Nazi Party in rural areas of Austria that maintained an informal protection structure. These groups provided accommodation, falsified documents, and warnings about Allied controls. They acted through a combination of ideological loyalty, personal ties, and fear of future reprisals if National Socialism resurged. Wagner temporarily worked in agricultural tasks under a false name and avoided any public exposure. The checks by Allied authorities were superficial due to the lack of local cooperation. In many villages, the population systematically protected the fugitives, and the German officials who worked under Allied supervision applied only the minimal measures necessary to pretend compliance. This environment allowed Wagner to remain hidden for long periods. Josef Mengele, doctor of the Auschwitz camp and responsible for lethal experiments, followed a different path. During the evacuation of the camp in January of 1945, he managed to join retreating German units, later being captured by American forces as a regular prisoner of war. Due to the absence of SS tattoos and the use of a false name, he was not identified. He was released in the summer of 1945, along with thousands of prisoners whose records were not deemed compromising. Once free, he headed to Bavaria, where his family owned an agricultural machinery factory in Günzburg. Thanks to the economic and social influence of the Mengeles, Josef found refuge in rural properties of former business partners, conservative landowners, and people linked to the family. These shelters included isolated farms, hunting cabins, and annex buildings belonging to families that had maintained close relationships with the Mengele company. The system worked through a network of favors accumulated over years. The protectors provided food, housing, and discretion. Mengele moved periodically between different shelters to avoid suspicion. During 1945 and 46, He did not seek to escape Europe or create a new identity. He simply hid in an environment where local silence, family loyalty, and the lack of precise administrative records protected him from possible identification. The Mengele family discreetly coordinated these movements, providing him with money and supplies through trusted employees who acted without leaving administrative traces. The operation of these networks also relied on the collaboration of civilian officials who remained in their positions under the supervision of Allied occupation. Civil registry clerks, municipal police officers, and identification office employees had access to birth, marriage, and death records. Some used these positions to create false identities based on deceased persons whose death records were not updated, or to introduce non-existent records into civil books. This procedure generated documents indistinguishable from the authentic ones. Even when the Allies attempted to verify the identity of a suspect, the local files presented perfectly coherent records. The deliberate destruction of documents was also common. Files of affiliation with the Nazi Party or the SS disappeared under the explanation of damage caused by bombings or hasty evacuations at the end of the war. Given the widespread level of destruction, these explanations could rarely be refuted. German municipal police officers played a significant role in this system. When they received orders to look for specific criminals, they only conducted the minimum necessary investigations. Home visits were scheduled at times when they knew the suspect would be absent. Interrogations were conducted without pressure, and vague answers were accepted. The final reports, addressed to their Allied supervisors, claimed the absence of results. This level of bureaucratic collaboration allowed escapes like those of Wagner or the concealment of Mengele to be prolonged without major difficulties. At first glance, the administrative procedures seemed to function adequately. Only detailed investigations carried out decades later revealed the systematic manipulation that facilitated the protection of these fugitives. The networks that operated between 1945 and 1946 combined ideological, familial, and religious factors. The lack of centralized records, the destruction caused by the war, and the administrative overload of the occupying powers created an environment in which false identities could thrive without rigorous control. Ecclesiastical roots, networks of former comrades, and family structures provided fugitives with safe spaces, while Allied authorities faced more urgent priorities. As the post-war period progressed and administrative systems stabilized, these routes began to close. But by then, several war criminals had already escaped the immediate reach of justice, marking the beginning of a prolonged period in which the international search for fugitives would become a constant element of European reconstruction. Hidden lives, fugitives blended in the devastated Europe. In the years immediately following the end of the war, the European map became a network of visible and hidden routes that allowed the survival and dispersal of numerous Nazi fugitives. Among them was Walter Rauff, a former SS officer linked to the development of the gas vans used in mass murders in occupied territories. Unlike other fugitives who turned to rural shelters or ecclesiastical networks, Rauff opted for a different strategy when arriving in Italy in the summer of 1945. He settled in Milan, an industrial city filled with displaced Germans and Italians seeking to rebuild their lives. In that densely populated urban environment, he rented a simple apartment in a working-class neighborhood and found employment in a company dedicated to the importation of machinery. The work activity was routine: order sorting, processing customs documents, and managing deliveries. He used a slightly altered name compared to the real one, enough to create administrative distance, but without compromising his memory. His employers, former Italian fascists who had maintained their businesses despite the regime change, knew his identity and had no interest in communicating it to the authorities. Milan offered a particular social structure in those years. The circles of former fascists, although politically weakened, maintained informal mutual support networks. They provided jobs, shared information about police movements, and met discreetly in cafes and private clubs where conversations could take place without interruption or excessive surveillance. Ralph occasionally attended these meetings, remaining reserved, integrating enough to receive alerts when necessary and avoiding any protagonism. His strategy was to live openly, mingling among thousands of foreign workers, but with controlled movements and carefully selected contacts. The Italian authorities knew that in Milan there were German refugees with dubious pasts, but identifying specific individuals required resources that could not be fully allocated to that task. The units of the United States Counterintelligence Corps received vague reports about Germans with particular accents or inaccurate names, but the lack of precise data prevented operational conclusions. In that environment of fragmentary information, Ralph managed to remain in the city for months without anyone verifying his past. A similar pattern was reproduced in Austria with the case of Eduard Roschmann, former commander of the Riga ghetto. After the collapse of the Reich, he arrived in Austria using forged military documents and settled in Graz, within the British occupation zone. Unlike fugitives who depended on religious networks or organized ideological sympathizers, Roschmann integrated into urban life using a false identity presented to local authorities as that of a displaced German merchant. The bureaucratic environment in Graz was overwhelmed with similar requests. Many officials processing documentation had previously served under the Nazi regime and lacked incentives to rigorously examine the history of each applicant who declared having lost documents during the war. Roschmann obtained residence and work permits under a fictitious name and engaged in informal commercial activities, a particularly active sector in post-war Austria due to widespread scarcity and the flourishing of the black market. Roschmann maintained a small warehouse where he accumulated various goods, used clothes, furniture, tools, and household items acquired through exchanges or favorable purchases. He operated mainly in cash to avoid administrative traces. He lived in an apartment building in the city center, where neighbors knew him as a quiet and reserved merchant. His presence did not arouse suspicion because thousands of people found themselves in similar situations, displaced, silent, focused on surviving and adapting. British controls were regular, but they focused on fugitives identified through specific reports. Roschmann appeared on extensive lists of wanted criminals, but these lists included thousands of names, and the capacity to investigate them was limited. During routine checks, he presented his false documentation and answered questions directly. There was nothing extraordinary in his behavior that would prompt deeper interrogations. Urban anonymity protected him as effectively as rural shelters did other fugitives. A different strategy was used by Erich Priebke, former SS captain responsible for the massacre of the Ardeatine caves in Rome. After the fall of the regime, he moved to South Tyrol, a German-speaking region where the local culture offered particularly favorable grounds to go unnoticed. He settled in a small mountain village and presented himself as a German refugee with false documentation. He found accommodation in a family guest house and occasionally worked in agricultural or construction tasks. His integration into the community was based on visible but controlled behaviors. He attended Mass, participated in limited social gatherings, and conversed with the locals about everyday topics. He did not seek to hide in a strict sense. His strategy was moderate normality in an environment where the presence of German refugees was not unusual. The Italian authorities in the region faced considerable cultural and linguistic tensions. The local population, predominantly German-speaking, maintained a distant attitude towards the Italian state. The Carabinieri conducted occasional patrols and checks, but the lack of neighborhood cooperation and language barriers hindered systematic investigations. Allied intelligence offices received vague information about fugitives in mountainous villages, but that information was too general to permit specific interventions. Visits by Allied patrols were reduced to superficial observations that did not reveal hidden identities. Priebke was seen on several occasions during these visits, but never formally identified. His presence blended in with dozens of refugees who shared similar linguistic and cultural traits. Another significant case was that of Léon de Grelle, Belgian fascist leader and member of the Waffen-SS. Unlike the underground approach adopted by other fugitives, de Grelle received direct state protection. After fleeing Belgium and arriving injured in Spain, he was hospitalized and later accommodated in private residences under the supervision of the Francoist government. Spain maintained an ideological stance close to the defeated fascism and refused to extradite de Grelle despite formal requests from Belgium. The regime argued that de Grelle was a political refugee, persecuted for anti-communist reasons, which justified the granting of asylum. This official protection allowed de Grelle to live openly in Madrid, maintain contacts with sympathizers, and publish writings. Although his presence was known by Western intelligence services, the international political structure prevented his capture. Spain represented an enclave where high-profile fugitives could continue their lives without needing to hide or create false identities. The Allied occupation authorities in Europe produced periodic reports on the presence of Nazi fugitives in Italy, Austria, and Spain. These documents mentioned names, described approximate locations, and indicated possible lines of investigation, but the information was fragmentary and too general for precise operations. Identifying war criminals required resources that had to be distributed among multiple priorities: administrative reconstruction, political surveillance, border control, and management of millions of displaced persons. Medium-level fugitives, such as Rauf, Rochman, or Priebke, were not among the top priority targets. They were considered dangerous elements, but their capture was not as urgent as that of regime leaders whose responsibility was broader and more public. The internal political context of the countries where these fugitives were hiding also played an important role. Italy, in the process of reconstruction, faced a deep polarization between communist, socialist, Christian democratic forces and remnants of fascism. Austria grappled with its dual identity as both victim and collaborator of Nazism, and its local population held a variety of attitudes toward German refugees. Spain, under Franco, used anti-communism to strengthen its international position, offering protection to individuals who fit its ideological narrative. The combination of these factors created an environment where the systematic persecution of Nazi war criminals did not become a national priority, even though there were external pressures for it. The fugitives who managed to remain in Europe during 1945–47 developed routines that seemed normal. They went to work, interacted with neighbors, participated in local activities, and maintained low profiles. Their safety depended on the combination of altered documentation, communities reluctant to cooperate with the authorities, and an overburdened Allied administration. The inherent tension of their situation was constant, though not always visible to those around them. The prolonged freedom of many depended on their discipline to avoid mistakes and their ability to adapt to the social environments in which they integrated. Captures occurred when these conditions were broken, by an unexpected report, by a chance encounter, or by a change in the political priorities of the countries where they resided. However, during these early post-war years, the social and political structure of Europe offered enough gaps for numerous fugitives to remain unidentified, invisible despite being in plain sight. Hidden routes, the silenced ports. In the years following the collapse of the Third Reich, the routes leading to South America were consolidated as one of the main escape mechanisms for Nazi war criminals. The journey frequently began in Austria, crossed the Brenner Pass into Italy, and continued to Rome, where obtaining documentation was carried out under a saturated humanitarian system. One of the fugitives who traveled this route was Adolf Eichmann. After living in hiding in Germany for almost 2 years, doing odd jobs in rural areas and avoiding any public presence, he joined networks that facilitated escapes to Latin American countries. To move towards Italy, he used false documents identifying him as Riccardo Clement. With this identity, he boarded a train from Innsbruck to Bolzano among regular passengers, merchants, workers, and displaced persons traveling between 2 war-devastated countries. The uniformity of this human flow allowed individuals with criminal pasts to travel without attracting the attention of border controls. Bolzano was one of the most important transit points for those crossing from Austria. The city, located in the German-speaking region of South Tyrol, offered specific advantages for the fugitives. Local officials, familiar with German and accustomed to receiving refugees who had lost documents during the war, processed applications without conducting thorough checks. The volume of displaced persons was high, and the administrative pressure considerable, which favoured speed in the procedures. Eichmann spent several days there following strict instructions, staying in a discreet boarding house, paying in cash, avoiding unnecessary conversations, and waiting for the signal to continue south. When he received the notice, he took a train to Rome. The Italian capital concentrated the offices of the International Red Cross and of the International Refugee Organization, institutions responsible for issuing travel documents for displaced persons seeking to emigrate outside the continent. Both organizations operated with limited resources against millions of applications. Each applicant submitted basic documentation, an ecclesiastical letter of recommendation, a plausible story about the loss of their papers during the war, and a form completed in the same place. The verification was superficial because there were no centralized identification systems. Names were recorded manually, and photographs were filed in physical folders impossible to cross-reference efficiently. Eichmann, as Ricardo Clement, presented the letters provided by ecclesiastical contacts. The official who assisted him recorded the data, checked the seals, verified that the documentation met the formal standards, and issued a travel document accrediting him as a German displaced person in the process of emigration. In appearance, he was one more among thousands. With that document, he was able to apply for an Argentine visa. The government of Juan Domingo Perón promoted European immigration as part of an economic modernization project. Argentine consular officials processed applications in Rome quickly and focused on ensuring that the documentation was complete and that the applicant presented a coherent story as a displaced European worker. There was no thorough verification mechanism to cross-check false names with international lists of wanted criminals. The lists contained real identities, not the aliases used by fugitives who appeared before the embassy. The Argentine visa for Ricardo Clement was approved in a matter of weeks. Genoa played a central role in the final phase of the escape. The port processed thousands of emigrants each month heading towards South America. Shipping companies operated regular routes, and port officials were limited to verifying that passengers presented a passport or a Red Cross document with its respective visa. The mission of the port staff was administrative, to review papers, stamp forms, and allow boarding. The absence of transnational verification systems made it impossible to compare fictitious identities with European criminal records. Eichmann bought a third-class ticket with money provided by the network and boarded in July of 1950 without attracting the attention of any Allied agent. During the 3 weeks of crossing to Buenos Aires, he lived with hundreds of European emigrants who shared collective cabins, common dining areas, and basic travel routines. His name did not stand out on any passenger list, and his behavior was identical to that of any person seeking to begin a new life. In Argentina, the entry of emigrants was processed at the port of Buenos Aires. Officials checked travel documents and visas, asked routine questions about the declared occupation, and stamped the entries without further scrutiny. This was the case with Eichmann. Ricardo Clement was officially admitted as a European immigrant, allowing him to integrate into a country that received tens of thousands of newcomers each year. A similar route had been used 1 year earlier by Joseph Mengele. After spending almost 3 years hidden in Bavaria, he decided to leave Europe in 1948. His family, with considerable economic resources, facilitated contacts that allowed him to access the same networks already used by other fugitives. Mengele followed the Innsbruck-Bolzano-Rome route, using elaborate aliases. In Rome, he presented letters of recommendation issued by ecclesiastical contacts, obtained a travel document from the Red Cross, and subsequently an Argentine visa. He embarked in Genoa in 1949. Once in Argentina, he joined the flow of European immigrants and managed to establish himself without being identified by the authorities. Ante Pavelić, leader of the independent state of Croatia, faced a more complex situation. Responsible for a regime that had perpetrated mass murders, he was initially captured by the British, but managed to escape under circumstances not completely clarified. He remained hidden in Austria, protected by Catholic networks that considered him an important figure in the fight against communism in the Balkans. His transfer to Rome was carried out through discreet operations involving monasteries and religious houses. Unlike other fugitives, Pavelić appeared on high-priority search lists. His ecclesiastical protectors had to create an entirely new identity that presented him as a Spanish priest. With that identity, he obtained travel permits and eventually embarked for Argentina from a secondary port to avoid recognition. The Croatian community in Buenos Aires received him upon his arrival, and the Argentine authorities did not act on extradition requests issued by Yugoslavia. The operation of these escapes was recorded in documents that decades later were reviewed by researchers. The passenger lists of the ships that departed from Genoa and other Mediterranean ports showed multiple fictitious identities that corresponded to Nazi war criminals. Italian officials processing these shipments did not have access to information that would allow them to identify irregularities. Shipping companies merely accepted documents that appeared valid. The post-war Mediterranean economic structure was based on massive flows of emigrants seeking job opportunities outside the continent, making any deep individual investigation difficult. The port of Genoa between 1948 and 1950 was a space of constant activity. Daily trains arrived loaded with emigrants from all over Italy and other European countries. The docks were filled with containers, luggage, and goods. The port bureaucracy focused on processing the transit of people and goods at a pace that avoided congestion. In that saturated environment, control procedures prioritized the fluidity of transit rather than detailed background checks. Allied intelligence units maintained a presence at the port, but directed their efforts towards suspects already identified through testimonies or concrete reports. There was no structured system to scan all shipments. Naples served as an alternative to Genoa. Its proximity to the south of Italy allowed fugitives to move towards a second point of embarkation when there was a perception that Genoa was under greater surveillance. Other fugitives opted for Spanish ports, where the protection that Franco's regime offered to some of them facilitated the final phase of the escape. In certain cases, even French or Yugoslav ports were occasionally used when circumstances permitted. This diversity of options contributed to fragmenting the Allied surveillance efforts because the resources were not sufficient to cover all the Mediterranean ports simultaneously. The role of the International Red Cross in issuing documents that allowed these escapes generated extensive debate in subsequent decades. The institution argued that its humanitarian mandate obligated it to assist the displaced without discriminating based on origin or personal history, and that it did not have the means to conduct thorough verifications. Its officials processed hundreds of requests weekly based on the documentation presented: ecclesiastical letters, identity statements, provisional certificates. They did not have access to international police files and could not differentiate between a genuine refugee who had lost documents and a war criminal with forged documentation. The administrative burden, combined with the institutional trust in religious stamps and official signatures, opened a space that was systematically used by networks supporting fugitives. The Argentine embassy in Rome shared similar limitations. Its function was to assess applications from European emigrants in a context where Argentina sought to attract labor and professionals. Consular officials reviewed the documentation submitted, verified that there was a contact letter in Argentina, and checked that the applicant was not on wanted criminals lists. Since those lists contained real names and not aliases, the check was insufficient. If the names submitted did not match the records, the applicant advanced in the process. The absence of global verification systems and reliance on documentation issued by institutions considered reliable created fertile ground for the use of fraudulent identities. The Atlantic crossing represented the final stage of the journey. The emigrants traveled in third class under basic but acceptable conditions. The cabins housed multiple bunks and limited spaces. Bathrooms and dining rooms were communal. During the journey, passengers coexisted without knowing the backgrounds of those accompanying them. Fugitives mingled among families, seeking opportunities on the American continent. In that environment, keeping a low profile was easy. It was enough to limit conversations to everyday topics and not offer additional information. The arrival in Buenos Aires completed the process. The controls were quick because the Argentine administrative structure needed to process large volumes of immigrants. The officials verified documents, asked basic questions, and allowed entry. Those fleeing who presented proper documentation passed without obstacles. From the port, they headed to boarding houses, homes of compatriots, or previously established contacts, and began a new life under false identities constructed with official documentation. Between 1947 and 1950, this combination of ecclesiastical networks, incomplete administrative procedures, saturated ports, lack of verification systems, and favorable migration policies allowed hundreds of Nazi war criminals to leave Europe legally. The process did not depend on complex secret operations, but on exploiting structural weaknesses in a continent that was trying to recover from the most devastating conflict in its history. The flow would continue as long as there were ports capable of processing emigrants and authorities willing to accept documentation that, apparently, met the formal requirements. Echoes of power, former Nazis integrated into the new Europe. Reinhard Gehlen, former general of the Wehrmacht and intelligence chief on the Eastern Front, understood early on that the end of the Reich did not mean the end of his usefulness. During the last months of the war, he ordered all military intelligence files on the Soviet Union that his unit had accumulated to be microfilmed. Those materials included assessments of the Red Army, outlines of Soviet political structures, identifications of espionage networks, and listings of agents operating in Eastern Europe. Gehlen had these microfilms stored in metal barrels buried in remote areas of Bavaria and surrendered to the American forces with a concrete offer. He and his team could put their knowledge at the service of Western interests in the new emerging confrontation. The Americans quickly assessed the proposal. Although the war had recently ended, tensions with the Soviet Union were growing. Allied cooperation was deteriorating, and disagreements were emerging over the future of Germany and Eastern Europe. American intelligence lacked in-depth information on Soviet capabilities, and what Gehlen offered was extremely valuable. He was transferred to the United States for extensive interrogations, during which he explained the scope of his files and the network of agents that had operated under his command. Upon his return to Germany in September of 1945, he was authorized to rebuild his organization under American supervision. With resources, facilities, and protection, he established the so-called Gehlen organization in Pullach, near Munich, and began recruiting his former subordinates. Many of those recruits had served in units involved in war crimes on the Eastern Front or had belonged to the SS. However, investigations into their past were minimal. The American priority was quick and straightforward: to rebuild an intelligence network against the Soviets. That organization operated as the de facto intelligence service of West Germany during the early years of occupation. Their reports were sent to both American authorities and German civil administrators. The microfilms recovered from Bavarian hideouts became the documentary basis from which analyses of the Soviet bloc's capabilities were developed. In 1956, with the creation of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, Gehlen was appointed its first director. The general, who had served directly under the Nazi regime, went on to lead the intelligence of a democratic state with explicit support from the United States. The situation of Gehlen illustrated a broader phenomenon. During the early post-war years, the Allied priority was the identification, capture, and prosecution of war criminals. The Nuremberg trials established fundamental legal frameworks and produced significant convictions. However, by 1948, the deterioration of relations with the Soviet Union changed strategic priorities. The Soviet blockade of Berlin, the consolidation of communist control in Eastern Europe, and the growth of global tensions turned former Nazi officers into potential sources of intelligence. Their knowledge of Soviet structures, clandestine networks, and military processes acquired on the Eastern Front transformed them from defeated enemies into useful collaborators. Klaus Barbie, former head of the Gestapo in Lyon, was one of the most notorious cases. Responsible for torture, deportations and executions during the German occupation in France, he managed to escape French custody after the war and hid in the American zone of Germany. By 1947, the United States Counterintelligence Corps had recruited him as an informant. Barbie knew communist networks in France and could provide information on Soviet agents in Western Europe. His crimes during the war were widely known, and France repeatedly requested his extradition. But the CIC rejected these requests, arguing that his handover would compromise ongoing intelligence operations. Diplomatic tension increased, and the press began to report that the United States was protecting a war criminal. By 1951, the CIC decided to facilitate his exit from Europe to avoid his capture. With false documentation and a discreet transfer to Italy, Barbie was shipped to Bolivia, where he lived for decades and occasionally collaborated with local intelligence services. He was not sent to France until 1983. The case of Wilhelm Hertel revealed another aspect of the same pattern. Hertel had been an SS officer in Austria and head of intelligence for the RSHA for Southeast Europe. He participated in repressive activities, collaborated in persecution operations, and handled sensitive information during the war. Captured by the Americans, he demonstrated knowledge of Soviet intelligence structures and clandestine networks in Eastern Europe. He provided testimony in the Nuremberg trials, including figures on Jewish victims that he attributed to data supplied by Adolf Eichmann. That testimony was considered useful for the prosecution. After the trials, Hertel was not prosecuted. He collaborated with Western intelligence services, resided in Austria, and never faced charges for his activities during the war, largely due to his value as an informant. These cases were not exceptional. They were part of a systematic practice by Western intelligence services that recruited former Nazis based on their technical capabilities, contacts in Eastern Europe, or knowledge acquired during the war. They competed with each other. The Americans recruited specialists in military intelligence, scientists, and technicians related to advanced programs. The British did the same in their occupation zone. The French obtained information from former German agents with experience in operations in Western Europe. In that competition, individuals with criminal pasts were protected by one Western power against accusations from another. Operation Paperclip was the most well-known manifestation of this phenomenon. Through it, the United States relocated to its territory German scientists who had worked on the Reich's military programs, especially in the development of missiles. Werner von Braun and his team became key figures in the American space program. Although von Braun had belonged to the SS and had been linked to production facilities that used forced labor, their dossiers were edited to minimize those facts. The reports that accompanied their relocation emphasized their scientific capabilities and omitted compromising information. The public narrative that presented him as an apolitical scientist facilitated his incorporation into the space program, and the moral dimension of his past was relegated to classified documents. Document sanitization was common practice. Many files of German scientists and technicians were reviewed to remove references to their Nazi affiliation or their participation in projects linked to the use of slave labor. These edited files allowed individuals with compromised pasts to enter the United States as specialists. Within the logic of the Cold War, the prevailing argument was that information and technological capabilities should be prioritized over any previous considerations. The threat posed by the Soviet Union justified, for those making strategic decisions, the reuse of personnel who only a few years earlier had served the Nazi regime. The operational consequences of this practice were significant. When a former Nazi became an asset of a Western intelligence agency, that agency had an interest in protecting them from any accusations. If judicial authorities from another country sought to prosecute them, the agencies could deny knowing their whereabouts or provide incomplete information. In some cases, they facilitated the escape of individuals under investigation or blocked extradition attempts. This interference complicated the work of prosecutors who were trying to reconstruct responsibilities for crimes committed during the war. They not only faced obstacles arising from the destruction of documents and the lack of local cooperation, but also the implicit or explicit resistance of Western agencies that considered those individuals useful pieces within the confrontation with the Soviet bloc. The protection was not permanent. When an individual ceased to be useful, the cover could disappear. But during the period in which they were considered relevant, they enjoyed practical immunity that shielded them from any judicial process. Barbie was moved to Bolivia when keeping him in Europe became problematic. Hertel, useful during the trials and in subsequent intelligence work, lived undisturbed. Galen, whose organization became structurally necessary for West Germany, maintained his position for years. In these cases, justice was subordinated to the strategic priorities of the time. The governments of West Germany and Austria also turned to ex-Nazis to rebuild their administrations. The creation of state structures required skilled personnel in administrative, police, judicial, and diplomatic areas. The initial purges carried out during denazification left vacancies that the new governments needed to fill quickly. Many of the available professionals had ties to the Nazi regime. The exclusion criteria were gradually relaxed, and thousands of ex-party members and SS were reintegrated into public positions. The continuity of personnel between the Nazi regime and the new democratic states created situations in which minor war criminals avoided prosecution because they held positions that allowed them to influence investigations or because the colleagues around them had equally compromised pasts. In West Germany, judicial processes regarding Nazi crimes were limited during the 1950s. Some cases advanced due to public pressure or the persistent work of victims and survivors, but the majority remained stalled. The authorities claimed lack of evidence or difficulties in locating witnesses. In reality, the lack of political will and the presence of former Nazis in positions of responsibility played a determining role. Austria advanced even more slowly. The country adopted the narrative of having been a victim of the Anschluss, minimizing the significant participation of Austrians in the Nazi regime. Many of the main camp administrators and authorities of the repressive apparatus were Austrian, but investigations against them were minimal. The social and political reintegration of former Austrian Nazis was broad and rapid. That stance postponed accountability for decades. By the mid-1950s, the reuse of ex-Nazis by Western intelligence services, along with their administrative reintegration in West Germany and Austria, created an environment in which justice for war crimes became irregular. The main leaders captured immediately after the war were tried and convicted. But hundreds of individuals with significant responsibilities managed to avoid prosecution due to their strategic utility, the lack of institutional pressure, or their integration into state structures that depended on their skills. Post-war Europe, immersed in the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union, made decisions that prioritized stability and security over accountability. That altered balance would define for years the possibilities of bringing to justice those who had actively participated in the Reich's policies. The documentary void, disappearances that challenge the records. Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo since 1939, remained in the Chancellery bunker during the last days of April of 1945. He had supervised political persecutions, deportations, and intelligence operations throughout occupied Europe, leaving behind an extensive documentary record. He was seen for the last time on the 1st or the 2nd of May, when several groups attempted to escape the fully besieged city. After that moment, his trail disappeared. The Soviet forces that captured Berlin inspected the bunker, interrogated survivors, and examined numerous corpses. They drew up lists of captured and identified dead, but Müller's name did not appear on any. There was no record of capture, nor any direct testimony confirming his death. During the following months, Western intelligence agencies tried to reconstruct his whereabouts. The total absence of information was striking due to his relevance within the Nazi apparatus. The testimonies of the bunker survivors were contradictory. Some mentioned seeing him on the night of the escape attempt. Others claimed not to have crossed paths with him again. No account included a verifiable description of his death. This lack of data generated three main hypotheses. The first held that Müller had been captured by the Soviets and recruited by their intelligence. Müller possessed detailed knowledge about German clandestine operations and infiltrated agents, making him a potential asset. However, the partial opening of Soviet archives after the fall of the Soviet Union did not reveal documents confirming that capture. The second hypothesis proposed that he had died in Berlin during the fighting. Thousands of corpses were buried without identification, and the massive destruction hindered the recovery of remains. The third, less accepted, suggested that he had escaped from Europe using clandestine routes. There was no documentary evidence to support this theory. By the mid-1950s, the investigation had lost momentum, and Müller's file remained open only nominally. Aribert Heim constituted a different case. As an SS doctor in Mauthausen, he was involved in lethal procedures and invasive experiments. After the war, he returned to Germany and lived under his own name. He established a private medical practice in Baden-Baden and practiced without hiding. For several years, his activity went unnoticed by the authorities. Testimonies from Mauthausen survivors began to mention his name more frequently in the early 1950s. The formal investigation was opened, but progressed slowly due to the accumulation of cases and the limited availability of specialized judicial personnel. When an arrest warrant was finally issued in 1962, Heim had left Germany. He lived in Egypt for decades using a false identity and died there in 1992. His escape demonstrated how the lack of early reaction in the 50s provided opportunities for suspects living openly to prepare discreet exits. Josef Schwamberger, former ghetto commander in Poland, also managed to disappear during this period. After the war, he lived in Austria with altered documentation. In 1948, he was arrested by the French occupation forces, but escaped from prison before being tried. The circumstances of the escape were never fully clarified and suggested external complicity. After escaping, Schwamberger ceased to appear in any European records. In the following years, isolated reports of possible sightings emerged, none verifiable. The search gradually diminished during the 1950s. Decades later, it was determined that he had arrived in Argentina under a false identity and lived there until his capture and extradition in 1990. His case illustrated the fragility of detention mechanisms in the early post-war years. The common element among these cases was the absence of documentation in a context where the registration systems were fragmented. The German records had suffered destruction by bombings or deliberate elimination. The civil registry offices in multiple cities had lost vital documentation. The Soviets possessed captured records, but cooperation with the West was minimal. The Western Allied archives contained materials captured in different zones, but it took years to organize them. Many files remained incomplete or unindexed. This situation created information gaps that allowed suspects to disappear without a trace. War crimes prosecutors relied heavily on witnesses. Survivor statements provided essential information, but they were not always enough to establish identities with criminal certainty years after the events. Photographs taken during the war, compared to the appearance of the suspects years later, raised doubts. The memory of traumatic events could be imprecise. The defense questioned the reliability of identifications, and the courts needed solid evidence to uphold convictions. For these reasons, numerous cases were filed away with the indication of insufficient evidence, even though there were well-founded suspicions. Political will also played an important role. West Germany and Austria were focused on economic reconstruction and integration into Western systems. Judicial prosecution of war crimes was seen by many sectors as a potential source of instability. The initial denazification had been strict, but by the mid-1950s it had lost intensity. Many officials with a Nazi past were integrated into local and national administrations. Investigating complex crimes could mean exposing that institutional continuity, which generated resistance. Prosecutors who did want to investigate faced budgetary limitations, lack of personnel, and a considerable backlog of pending cases. The context of the Cold War added additional obstacles. Many crimes had occurred in territories that now formed part of the Soviet bloc. Key witnesses resided in countries with communication and mobility restrictions. Soviet archives remained closed. Judicial cooperation between the blocs was limited, and documents provided by communist countries were received with caution due to the possibility of political manipulation. Consequently, potentially crucial evidence remained inaccessible or was discarded due to lack of reliability. The unresolved files were piling up in West German prosecutors' offices, Austria, and other jurisdictions. They contained photographs, physical descriptions, partial testimonies, and lists of attributed crimes. But the essential information was missing: current locations, alternative identities, recent movements. Heinrich Müller was listed in these files only with his last confirmed location in May of 1945. Aribert Heim appeared as a suspect, but without proper tracking. Schwamberger was listed as escaped without subsequent information. These files were sporadically reviewed when a new lead emerged, but in most cases they remained inactive due to lack of verifiable information. Organizations dedicated to the pursuit of war criminals tried to maintain public pressure. They compiled lists of the most wanted, collected testimonies, and investigated leads. However, they lacked direct operational capacity. They depended on governments and prosecutors to decide to act. When there was no political will, the information gathered did not produce results. Heinrich Müller remained on international lists for decades without any confirmable lead emerging. Heim and Schwamberger were only found decades later when new investigations had more resources and a different international context. By the mid-50s, it was evident that numerous Nazi war criminals would not be captured. Some had died without being identified in the last combats. Others had escaped and established new identities. Some lived in countries that did not cooperate with extradition requests, and others, like Müller, had completely vanished in the absence of documentation in the immediate post-war period. These cases established a clear limit to the possibilities of historical and judicial reconstruction. The files remained open, but without realistic expectation of resolution. Cold War Europe had inherited not only the crimes of the Reich, but also the administrative voids that allowed some of those responsible to remain forever beyond the reach of justice.